Good morning. My name is Seamus Mulconry. I'm a strategy consultant and a public affairs consultant. In essence, for the last 30 years now, I've been pestering governments with ideas on a wide range of things. Everything from the decriminalisation of suicide to shared services and electronic government. However, what I would stress, in sessions like this, it's usually the other participants that you learn most from. You all have a lot of experience of lobbying. You've always been dealing with politicians to make your case. So you will probably learn more from each other than you will from me. Nevertheless, I hope my presentation will have something in it which you may find of use or value. We're just switching presentations. As John said, we are now all in election mode. If you head up to Leinster House, or if you are talking to politicians, they are all preparing for an election. Nobody's quite too sure when it will occur. The conventional wisdom at the moment is that the Taoiseach will cut and run in the autumn. I doubt that. The poll numbers are not looking strong enough for him just yet. And also the Fine Gael Ordesh is scheduled for January, February. So I think he's going to hold on and go the distance. I think he's also going to go the distance because part of the campaign mantra for the government is stability, and they'll want to show that they are stable and that they have gone the entire distance. Whether or not that happens, now is the time to start talking to all of the political parties for a couple of reasons. In general, once the election campaign actually happens, they're far too busy to talk to anybody. And certainly even if you do talk to them, they're not going to be listening. So it's a time to build relationships. The other thing is the manifestos for government are now being written by all of the parties. TDs are trying to figure out what they want to get into them. An election, in the build-up to an election, what you're looking at is an opportunity to get ideas into government. Most of the time, government is concerned with implementation, getting things done and saying no to people. But during an election campaign, they sit back and go, okay, who do we talk to? What's an interesting idea? Who can we work with? So it's a great time to be out there talking to people. If you look at the if you look at the opinion polls, it's very difficult to figure out who in fact is going to be in government after the election. The polls are going up and down on a regular basis. Virtually every poll sees some movement. Most commentators believe that the likeliest outcome is a Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael coalition. That, however, is something that has never happened before. And while the commentators think this is a great idea, none of the people in either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil are madly enthusiastic, so they will look for other options. Possibly. Practically what this means for you is you've got to talk to everybody because you're not too sure who's going to be in government. One key thing to understand with any coalition government, it isn't the party that has the most numbers which is the most powerful. It is the party which has the capacity to bring the government down. So if you have a party that has 5 or 6 seats, but it can bring the government down, they have got clout. So you need to talk to everybody. John mentioned the programme for government. The programme for government is often aspirational, but if you talk to the civil service, that is their Bible. That is what the elected representatives of the Irish people have said they are going to deliver in this government, and that's what the civil servants work towards. Now that doesn't mean it happens automatically. Unless there is pressure, unless there is somebody saying this is important, it doesn't happen. So your first job is to get something in there. Your second job is to make sure that it's actually implemented. To do that, your easiest route in is to get into the manifestos. And the way to get into the manifestos is to talk in general to the TDs who will be inputting to the manifestos. For anybody involved in the health space, that means the Oireachtas Committee on Health. If you get into the manifestos, you have a much stronger chance of getting into the subsequent programme for government. When the 2 parties or 3 parties or even 4 parties sit down to negotiate, they will be looking at their own manifestos. That's their shopping list. There will be items in there that they both look at and go, yeah, we can live with that. You know, it's not it's not a problem. So that it just cut and pasted in. So the more you're in the manifestos, and if you're in more than one manifesto, all the better, the more likely you are to be in the programme for government. In the first instance, these are the people that you absolutely need to talk to, and it's the Oireachtas Committee on Health. There are a couple of...
Well, the upper house.
That includes the upper house. I think there are a couple of things just to note. You can do a presentation to the Oireachtas Health Committee, but it's not easy to get on their agenda. They have a very packed agenda, and unless you have something big that you want to talk to them about, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. To be quite honest, they get annoyed with organisations arriving in to tell them how wonderful they are. There are a lot of organisations who use it as a tool, a presentation, not so much to talk to the committee, but to show their own members that they're active. It annoys them. So unless you've got something big to ask them, don't necessarily go for that. Now there could be something that is big and that is important, and that's a big new idea, then it's worth doing. But otherwise, avoid it. The other way you can talk to them is to do the standard. Do the event in Boswells. Generally the best time to pick is a Wednesday afternoon. There are less committee sitting, so you're more likely to get people. Arrange to have a little bit of food. Most TDs are racing around the place from one meeting to another. They don't get a chance to eat that much. When they're starving, a sandwich and a cup of tea puts them in the right mood. Presentations, there's a problem with presentations. You'll have TDs coming and going, so they may actually be missing what you're trying to say to them. I was in recently with a committee chair and he said, look, what really works sometimes is to have enough of your people there so you can sit down individually with the TDs and talk them through your talking points. But definitely, if you can, you've got to talk to these people. Now, you may be able to talk to them in their own constituencies. If you can, that is a great way to do it, i.e. if you have members in a constituency or your organisation is based in a constituency. Not everybody is equal. Politicians pay far more attention to constituents than they do to anybody else. Something you need to understand about the political brain, and it's not just about how politicians think, it's how all of us think. We make our decisions based on emotions, not on logic. There's a very good book called, appropriately enough, The Political Brain, that looked at brain scans of people discussing politics. And the interesting thing was the areas of the brain that deal with logic do not light up at all. It's the areas that deal with emotion. So if you want to make a connection and persuade a politician to do something, you better go in there with an emotional argument, something that connects with them, and then back it up with logic. A lot of the statistics that you use aren't so much about persuasion. They're about giving the TD the ammunition to make the arguments afterwards and feel that they're making the right arguments. The size of the part of the brain that deals with logic is about the size of a pea. The part that deals with emotion is about the size of your fist, and this always wins. So it's a standard rule of communication. Emotion followed by logic, not the other way around. There are a couple of other things to remember about specifically the brains of politicians. For a start, they are all incredibly time pressed. They don't have much time. They are invariably multitasking. Multitasking is a very inefficient way of using your head. So you've got to make life easy for them. When I say make life easy for them, if you are making or submitting a document, one page written in 13 or 14 font is far better. They need to be able to get something where they can glance at it and get the key messages. Often, that's your only opportunity to get them. They're chasing from meeting to meeting. Now, you may say, we're dealing with really complex issues. We can't get it onto one page. The reality is, if you can't get it onto one page, you don't understand it. The most complex ideas can be articulated in a short document, if you understand what you're talking about. They're time pressed. They are much more focused on people from their own constituencies, and at this time in the cycle, they're focused on re-election. There are some of them who are looking at a very bleak future. They're all concerned about getting re-elected. So anything that helps them to get re-elected is something they will pay attention to. The very fact that 13% of the population have a disability is a very powerful thing to remind politicians of. And anything that relates, as John said, to bring it back to their constituency, to be able to tell them how many people in Clare, in Kerry, wherever, have a disability, what their situation is, anything that brings it home is a very powerful argument and works very well with them. You'll often hear it said that politicians and parties are all the same. I think they are all the same. They're all decent men and women who are trying to do their best to make Ireland a better place to live and to work and to get ahead in. I've been dealing with politicians for about 20 years. I have very rarely met people that I kind of went, that person is not a good person, or that person is just out for themselves. Most of them are out to do their best for the country. Now, the reason I stress that to you is, over the last number of years, politicians in every single party have been at the receiving end of a lot of vitriol and a lot of contempt. If you walk in with the attitude that, you're some kind of a crook, they will read it off you like a shot. It doesn't do your case any good. Remember, to get elected, you've got to have a high level of emotional intelligence. You've got to be able to read people. You've got to be able to work with people so they can read you like an open book. Don't, for example, if you are a lifelong Fianna Fáiler, pretend to be a Fine Gaeler. Anybody who says, I've always voted Fine Gael, but I'm never going to vote unless you do this, is automatically assumed to be a liar. Don't do it. If you are a lifelong Fine Gaeler, don't go in and say that you were at a Fianna Fáil branch meeting. Fianna Fáil doesn't have branches, it has Cummins. They will pick up straight away that you are bluffing them. They don't expect you to naturally be their supporters. They do expect you to be reasonably straight with them. So be straight with them. If you are bringing in a delegation, either in Leinster House or to meet with a TD, a couple of things to be careful of. One, as I said to you, not everybody is equal. In the eyes of politicians, people who interact a lot with the wider community are far more influential and will be listened to far more. So if you're going in with an introverted professor who is an expert on neurological problems, that's probably far less impactful than if you are going in to somebody who's involved in their local GAA club, in their local community, who either has a neurological problem or has a relative who has. Somebody who is out and about a lot gets listened to. Make sure also that you're bringing in people who are sane and sensible. By sane and sensible, people who will not go in there and do something stupid. It happens all the time with delegations. I don't know how many times I've been on the opposite side of a delegation where some guy has brought up politicians' expenses or some scandal or something else, and you're looking going, you're trying to persuade and you're actually insulting people? Because there are people who join a delegation who are more interested in what they're going to tell people in the bar at home afterwards than in getting your point across. The whole point of lobbying is to persuade somebody to do something for you. It is not to win an argument, it is not to show off. So don't let anybody like that on your delegation. 2 or 3 is plenty. Remember, you're going to probably be meeting one person, so you don't want to overwhelm them. Always have a person there who observes the meeting, because you want to, did that go well or not? Like, I now would find it very hard to read, are you listening to me or not? John will probably have a better idea because he's able to observe in a better way. So always have somebody who's observing. Do, a couple of absolute do's. Prepare. Whoever you're going to talk to, learn as much as you can about them. Google is brilliant for this. Use it. Talk to anybody who knows them or has any kind of a personal connection with them. You can often find that, it's an interest in hurling or it's something else that allows you to make that initial human connection. One of my friends is a very successful TD and one of the best lobbyists in Leinster House. And I met him one time and he was having a great conversation with the minister about skiing. And I kind of said to him, and I won't say the name, I said, I didn't think you knew, I never figured you for a skier. I said, Seamus, I haven't a clue about skiing. But he said, I know the minister is really interested, so I read a book on it. Every time we meet, we have a great conversation about skiing. And on every third occasion, I ask him for something. So find out as much as you can. Craft and test your key messages. Write them down. Get somebody to tear them to shreds and then write them down again. Keep on testing them so that they're as concise and as good an articulation of what you want as you can get. Revise, 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 and get somebody else to tear it to shreds for you. Anytime that I've gone in with a document that had gone through that kind of a process, it worked. Writing down your first thoughts and kind of that's good enough doesn't. Practice if you have a delegation. Get people to go through their paces. A lot of the time you'll be working with people who haven't done it before and they're nervous. You don't want them to be too polished, but you do want them to make sure that they get their points across. TDs aren't looking for a polished performance. They're looking for somebody who's genuine, who actually believes in what they're saying. By the way, if you are going to tell a lie, there's only one way to lie effectively, and that's believe it yourself. If you convince yourself, you convince somebody else. But if you haven't convinced yourself, forget it. Connect. When you go in, you've got a couple of minutes in the initial phase to make that human connection. Make sure you do that. As I said,
Rebels used to do the things for the show bands, remember the clubs?
Yep. Anything that makes a connection. It can be a hobby, a sport, a person they know, you're from the same county.
The show band were involved with.
Absolutely. Communicate. The whole thing that you're trying to do is to get a message across. Make sure you do. But remember, communication is a two-way street. I was at a meeting recently where people came in to lobby a minister. And the minister basically was giving them a lot of information, but they weren't listening. They were so in present mode, they weren't kind of paying any attention to what the minister was saying. And the minister was basically saying, guys, I think you have a problem here. You need to address it. If they'd picked up on it, it would have done them a lot of good. But they walked out, and I'm firmly convinced they never actually listened. Particularly when you're talking to TDs. I mean, for example, if you go into Jerry Buttimer, the chair of the Oireachtas Committee, who will probably be a route into the Fine Gael manifesto because getting to see the minister will be fairly tough. Jerry's actually a very decent guy, and he'll help you with information. He'll say who you should talk to. He'll point out, you might want to talk to this researcher because they'll be working on this particular aspect. So, ask them questions. Also, there's another thing. If you ask a TD questions, that automatically kind of brings them on your side. When they're giving you advice, it changes the relationship. You're no longer pitching to them. You're taking something from them, and it builds a better relationship. Follow up. You do your meeting, get back to say, thanks very much for the meeting. Allows you to send in your key points again, so you're keeping the communication going. Repay. If somebody does you a favor, make sure you do it back. There are loads of different ways of doing favors. For example, you can talk about the politician. If you're talking about Sean Sherlock down in Cork, there's no point in kind of saying that he's a thoughtful, considered politician who really knows his brief. Say he's a Trojan worker, a great man to do a turn. That kind of language that's actually useful to him in his constituency. It depends on your audience, but try and repay the favor. If you, for example, have a delegation to the committee, or sorry, not to the committee, but to the Dáil, and you get maybe 30 people to attend, guarantee you there'll be 3 or 4 that actually go out of their way to be helpful. Make sure you remember and repay them, because you're going to need them for the long haul. It's not just about this election campaign. particularly with younger TDs, they're going to be there for a long time. And with older ones, they're going to have influence for a long time or becoming ministers. You want to build and maintain the relationships. Don't. A couple of things not to do. You're all members of not-for-profit organizations. You believe passionately in what you're doing. Therefore, you have some weaknesses. I have met lots of delegations where people patronize, preach at, or put down the person they're trying to persuade. They're so convinced of the rightness of their cause and the justice of what they're doing that they kind of forget that the person on the other side of the table is actually trying to help them. And he's not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. When you're communicating, always make sure you try and think yourself into the other person's shoes. Try to see it from their perspective and tailor your communication that way. Guarantee you, wagging a finger or banging the table doesn't work. Another thing politicians do is meet lots of people who are a little bit weird. There are lots of people going in there, they're either weird or they are trying to lobby for something that if it's not illegal, it should be. So, they have a lot of these kind of people arriving in. You are working, remember, you're working for a cause that has a tangible benefit for their constituents. You're on the same team, work with them. The media. If there's one gripe I have about politicians, it's that they pay far too much attention to the media. They read it, they listen to it. Therefore, you need to be on it. Local radio is much easier to get on, but here's the thing. Politicians pay a lot more attention to local radio in general than they do to Morning Ireland, because it's talking to their constituents. Therefore, it's really important. If you can at all, try and get on the morning programs around the country. They'll generally give you an easier ride than a Morning Ireland, because to be honest, they're more interested in what you have to say. When you're on, I said this to somebody earlier on, they laughed at me, smile. People on radio or people at home can actually hear the smile. When you're smiling, they think you're a nice guy. When you're not, they think you're a bit of an asshole. The one time I got absolutely wiped out in a debate, I was on really pompous. I deserved the kicking I got. Don't do that. Smile, make your case. Try and make the stories, tell stories about real people, because people listen to and understand stories as a form of communication better than they do statistics. And if a TD has been good to you, positively name check them. Because I can guarantee you one thing, once you mention the TD's name, he's going to hear it or she's going to hear it. A lot of talk about social media versus legacy media. I actually don't see any difference. They're all channels to reaching your audience. An article in the journal is every bit as good in terms of reaching an audience as an article in the Irish Times, and it's a lot easier to get. The one thing I would say to you about legacy media is it tends to shape the national conversation. So if you can get in there, you have more hope of shaping the overall broad national conversation. But to be honest, as I said, the journal, if you want simply eyeballs, if you get media coverage, bring it with you, photocopy it, just hand it over. The reason being, as I said to you, politicians pay far too much attention to the media, and if they see it in the media, it makes it more real for them. As I said, it's the one gripe that I have against them. Social media is increasingly important, but it's increasingly important as a means of mobilizing your own supporters. You don't win arguments in social media. If you're on Twitter and you're part of a Twitter fight, are you going to influence anybody? No. But if you want to mobilize your own supporters, it's really important. It was used particularly by Obama in his first campaign. It was used by the recent referendum campaign. It's a good way of mobilizing your own people. If I was asked for a wish list of how I would influence the government, I'll be quite honest with you. The first thing I would say is, get me access to the focus groups that are being used by the government to figure out what's important to the people. I can talk to them. You can influence the manifesto in ways, but nobody gets that. But what you can do is get your own members to talk to politicians and canvassers on the doorsteps. If you can do that, particularly once the election starts, that gets back really quickly. Every evening after a canvass, the TD will meet with the canvassers to find out what's going on. If you can influence that process, you will stick in their mind. And over to you now for questions and answers.